You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome back to another episode of Ethnosynology. I'm your host, David Ian Howe. I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist, and today we are talking with Aaron Deter-Wolf, a fan favorite guest of A Life in Ruins, also a fan favorite of Instagram and any public archaeology. Aaron Deter-Wolf is the leading expert and the leading, voice in the anthropology of tattooing, something I find incredibly fascinating, that I think most people also should find incredibly fascinating, even if you don't have tattoos or even like tattoos. Much like dogs, stone tools, or farming, or music, I should say, or art, tattooing is an intrinsic part of humanity and always has been, and I think always will be. So I've waited to do this episode because I wanted to do it in person. Aaron lives in Nashville, where my parents used to live. Now they live in Knoxville, but I was in Tennessee, and I was like, you know what? I'll drive 2 hours. Let's record this episode with Aaron to do it in person, so I have the video version as well. However, as per usual, the audio version here will be the extended, fuller edit of the episode, so you get the better end of the deal here listening. The video version will be on YouTube because this one will have a lot of visual components to it, but the full, more extended, in-depth interview is what you're going to hear here today. So, without further ado, let's talk to Aaron Deter-Wolf, author of Ancient Ink, the Tattoo Archaeologist. There we go. That's the book title is Ancient Ink. His title that I have given him now is the archaeologist, or the tattoo archaeologist. There we go. All right, continuing on. Aaron, can you state your name and your affiliation for the audience?
My name is Aaron Deter-Wolf. I'm an archaeologist with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology here in Nashville and a visiting professor at the University of Northampton.
You recently wrote a book, correct?
Yeah, it's called Ancient Ink, the Archaeology of Tattooing, and Lars Krutak and I were the editors of that volume. And so since it's an edited academic volume, what it does is it draws together chapters by a bunch of different archaeologists and scholars, each of whom is looking at something that they are themselves an expert in. So Renee Friedman is writing in on Egyptian tattoos, and Svetlana Pankova is writing in on the Pazyrak, the Scythian Iron Age tattoos. And then Lars and I both contributed work in it as well, but then our role was primarily editors and trying to make it flow. And, we were reasonably successful with that. Academic volumes are difficult for the public to read, and I think I'd like to do a new edition of that book, or a new take on that same idea in which we write it with the public in mind and try to make it in a single voice rather than having all of these different voices contribute independently to it.
So I study dogs in human cultural contexts, so studying dog anthropology, essentially. You study tattoo anthropology. Is it called ethno-tattooology? I'm assuming not. But also, would you consider tattooing to be part of being human?
Yeah, well, so in terms of, the anthropology and understanding how tattooing fits in with human nature, I think, we sort of have to take a step back and talk about tattooing in terms of body decoration. And, there's body modification, which is permanent, and then there's body decoration, which is impermanent. And body decoration and arguably modification are cultural universals. They are one of these things like making fire, like knapping flint, that has been a part of every human culture as far back as we can show archaeologically, and older than that they probably were. We just don't have the specific archaeological evidence for it yet. But these are things that cultures do. They people want to show who they are. They want to exhibit who they are, who they want to be, who they aspire to be, and they want to shift the narrative about how people see them. And so, these are very complicated and symbolic things. And every culture has done this in order to interact with each other and in order to, build their identities both within their culture, but then also to build their identities and their perceptions of themselves in the larger world, in the symbolic world, in the cosmos that they believe in, and all of this. And so, my feeling about this in regard to tattooing is that body decoration that is impermanent is really important to human culture. So body decoration that is permanent, that stays with you your entire life, that's even more significant. And so I think that very early on in our shared human past, if we could find the evidence, I think that people were very early on modifying their bodies. Now, that may initially have been scarification rather than tattooing, if we look back to African traditions, for example. But, it's entirely likely that tattooing was happening as soon as people were able to stick sharp things into the fire pit and get ash on them.
What's the oldest direct evidence of tattooing?
So the oldest direct evidence that we have so far is Ötzi the Iceman, is this guy who was, shot in the back with an arrow and died in the Alps between Italy and Austria about 5,000 years ago, about 3,200 BC. And he has 61 preserved tattoos on his body that were made with carbon ink, made with soot and ash that was collected from around a campfire, we think. And he's the oldest direct evidence, meaning he is the oldest preserved tattoos. But the oldest potential evidence goes back much further than that. So, for example, some Russian archaeologists have identified some stone tools from the Kamchatka Peninsula that date back to the very early Holocene, possibly late Pleistocene, that they have looked at the use-wear patterns on those tools and think that they were used to shallowly pierce human skin in a manner that would be consistent with tattooing. The other piece of indirect evidence we have is artwork. And the earliest depictions of the human body in our cultural history have decoration. You think back to the Venus figurines, which are, I think it's some of the oldest, going back to 42,000 years before present or so. The Venus of Hofels from the cave in Germany is one of the very earliest. She's this small figurine carved out of mammoth ivory, and her body is covered with these incisions all across her running down her arms and across her chest and across her breasts. And, that's very difficult to read. That could be clothing, or it could be something else, or it could be scarification or tattooing. And so that's why I say those are the oldest potential pieces of evidence. But if we want to talk direct, provable evidence, it's Ötzi the Iceman.
How did you get into this? Like, how did you become the tattoo guy?
So I did my graduate work actually on Maya archaeology, sites down in Guatemala and Belize. And, when we think about the Maya culture, we know that, sorry, let me start that over. So I did my graduate studies in Maya archaeology, working at ancient Maya sites in Guatemala and Belize. And the ancient Maya are a culture that we know modified their bodies very heavily. They, reshaped their skulls, they did dental inlays, they filed their teeth, they tattooed and scarified and pierced. And so working in Mesoamerica, as an archaeologist, you find the artifacts of body modification. You find things like stingray spines that were used to pierce the genitals, or obsidian blades that were used to slice the skin. Now, after my degree, when I moved up to Tennessee and started doing archaeology here in the American Southeast, I started to be bothered or concerned about the fact that North American archaeologists weren't finding those same artifacts. So there's this very robust historical record of when the first Europeans encounter Native Americans in North America. And almost universally in those records of first encounters, they describe tattooed bodies. And so if we take then that much or most of Native North America was tattooing by the 1500s, then there should be a very robust archaeological record of that practice. But when I started doing this work, there were probably fewer than a dozen instances in the entire continent of people identifying tattooing tools in archaeological collections. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that a lot of the tattooing technologies may have been biodegradable. They were things that don't survive in the archaeological record. But I think also an older generation of archaeologists wasn't looking for these things. And so that's sort of what started me on this research rabbit hole, was trying to figure out how I could do better. What could I do to actually identify these tools? What were, reproducible, scientifically sound methods that I could use to look at ancient tattooing in North America? And then it turns out this is actually a problem all over the world. And, we know that ancient Egyptians tattooed, but we do not know the tools that they used. So the same questions apply all over the world, and just sort of launched me into this, this space where it turns out there weren't many people working or talking. And that was very lucky. And it's kept me interested for over a decade now.
You mentioned organic tattooing tools, and that those are difficult to find archaeologically. What would what would that include?
Yeah, so organic tools for tattooing vary widely depending on the environment that is surrounding a given culture. And so, for example, things that we find in the Pacific include citrus thorns that can grow. Living in Tennessee, people are like, citrus thorns, they're this big. But, citrus thorns in the Pacific can be, half inch, 2 inches long. Throughout the American Southwest, cacti, agave spines, porcupine quills, all sorts of things like this. And, we don't usually find those archaeologically. Those aren't things that survive except in very rare instances. And so when I've been doing this research, I've been focusing more on things like bone tools that have a higher probability of surviving in archaeological collections.
Yeah. When I met with you and Danny in your backyard and he tattooed me.
That makes it sound so professional.
Yeah. We used a deer bone, right? I remember you sharpening a deer bone that we used as the awl or the puncture tool to put the ink in my arm.
Yeah. And so one of the pieces of research that I did along the way was looking at microwear patterns, at trace wear analysis, and trying to determine if when you use a sharp bone tool to tattoo, whether that created a definable and replicable microscopic pattern that was different than if you use that same tool for piercing leather, for making clothes, or for working basketry, or using it as a pin on your clothes or in your hair. And it was Christian Gates St. Pierre at University of Montreal who actually then was able to identify the specific wear pattern of tattooing and was able to show that, yes, that shallowly piercing live skin leaves a different pattern on bone tools than using those same tools for any other use. And so that's a really cool thing that we can now turn to archaeological collections and look at tools and look at their tips under the microscope and have a much better chance of saying that they were used for tattooing.
So you do a lot of experimental work, yeah?
So my interest in experimental archaeology came about out of this desire to see if we could show that certain bone tools were used for tattooing as opposed to being used for other things. And to do that, you have to make and test and examine the tools. Use-wear analysis is something that goes back to at least the 1970s in archaeology, right? This idea that you could take a stone flake or a bone tool and by creating one of your own and using it for certain tasks, you can then look at it under the microscope and determine what task it was used for. Carving wood leaves a different signature on a stone tool than cutting grass does, for example. Okay, so that's what got me into experimental archaeology originally. And then sort of through that process, I got to know and be friends with some really fantastic tattooers from all around the world who aren't themselves doing what they would have considered experimental archaeology, but because they are interested in the history of their profession and in pre-electric technologies and, deliberate connections with people that they're tattooing and things like this, had been experimenting with similar tools, non-electric tools, so with flint blades or with bone tools or things like this. So at a certain point, I had started chatting with Danny Ridday, who's a tattooer who works currently in France, in the Dordogne region of France. He's on Instagram as Totemic Tattoo, and he gave you a tattoo at my house last year. Yeah. And Danny is a fantastic guy. He's a citizen scientist. He does all non-electric tattooing. And he, I think, is one of the first contemporary tattooers to incorporate lithic, so stone tool incision tattooing into their professional practice. And so Danny and I, since COVID, I think is actually when you introduced us. You introduced Danny and I over Instagram. And since COVID, then Danny and I have been talking about all these different topics about tools and technologies and tattooing. And one of the things that we wanted to look at was whether we could show scientifically that different tools used in different ways create different tattoos. And when I say that, right, every tattooer who's watching this is like, no shit. Every artist is like, no kidding, right? You use a different brush for making different sorts of marks on a painting. You use, a round liner leaves a much different tattoo than a magnum. You use different tools to get different results. Every tattooer knows this, but what we wanted to do was show it in the academy, to be able to publish it in a documented way that is replicable so that other archaeologists who are not tattooers could understand it and could refer to that data. And so we designed an experiment where we created, I think, 8 different tools, everything from bone needles to obsidian blades to several different varieties of bird bone and boar's tooth combs that were hand tapped. And Danny used all those tools to tattoo himself, to tattoo the same design 8 times on his leg. And then as his leg healed, we looked at each of those tattoos to see how the ink settled and what the final tattoo looked like. And what we were able to show is that, yes, different techniques, different tools leave different results on the skin. That in itself was kind of cool, right? But then we started thinking about that data and we said, well, now that we've got this data, can we apply this to preserved tattoos? Could we apply this to tattooed mummies? And so the first one we took a look at was Ötzi, who has these 61 tattoos on his body. And for 30 years since his discovery, almost every media description of Ötzi, almost every publication on him has mentioned kind of in passing, and his tattoos were cut into the skin using a knife or with stone. There was never any positive evidence to back that up. That was just hearsay that was being passed down for 30 years. And so by looking at the results of our experiment and comparing the physical results of tattooing with stone and tattooing with bone and tattooing with copper to Ötzi's actual tattoos, we could show that they were not incised. They were absolutely not cut into the skin. They were hand poked, probably with a single point needle, and that could have been bone or it could have been copper. And we can't, our results are not that fine, but we were able to show that that was what was happening.
After we met up again in Nashville with Danny last year, you went to a conference in Peru, is that correct?
Yeah, so this was sort of a thing I never saw coming. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, are you going to be studying tattoos in Peru? I absolutely would have never crossed my mind. But so how this all came about was after doing this experiment with Danny and with Maya Siluk Jacobsen, who was one of the other authors on that, and looking at Ötzi's tattoos, we then started using the same body of data to look at other tattoos from other places. And as it turns out, so I had years ago gone to a very prestigious museum in the United States to look at something completely unrelated to tattooing. And while I was there, they said, "Oh, you're that guy who likes tattoos. Did you know we have South American mummies with tattoos on them?" And I said, "No, I did not know that." And so while I was there, I had the chance to look at the set of remains from 5 or 6 sites in Peru, all of which had just beautiful tattoos on them, just absolutely incredible. These were all forearms, so they were from the elbow to the fingertips, so, isolated remains, but all of which had these just incredibly preserved tattoos. I had sort of known that tattooing took place in ancient Peru. It's been talked about in the literature since, the 1890s, but really not much had been done on it since the 1980s or so. And became really interested in this and, what else might be out there. And then via Instagram, of all things, Danny was contacted by a woman who's now a friend of ours who was working at a museum who said, "Oh, we have tattooed mummies in the basement. And, do you think you might want to come see these?" Yeah, we do. And so we ended up writing a proposal, Danny and I did, to go to the museum and to look at these tattooed remains from South America. And it was I still get goosebumps thinking about it, right? So like Danny and Rhoda and I went into this museum on a Monday. We thought we were going to look at like 10 examples, and 230 something later, right? So by Wednesday or Thursday, I was having this kind of like panic attack in my head, because I was like, in this week, we have recorded more preserved ancient tattoos than have been published collectively in the entire global archaeology to date. That's cool. What are we going to, what now? What are we going to do with this? And so this just sort of turned into this bigger thing. We've met a couple of European scholars who are really interested in these same topics and who had been recording Peruvian tattoos at other institutions. My buddy Ben Robitaille, who's he's on Instagram as Soot Collective or as Zapato Locust. he has this interest in South American archaeology and his background, and has really sort of taken lead on the interpretation of these things then. And so for the last couple of years, we've been going to Europe and going to Peru to document more preserved tattoos. And at this point, we're up to several hundred. We're using a bunch of different technologies to look at them. And we've just found so many of them now that we're actually starting to be able to scratch the surface on, defining style, being able to recognize what is and isn't part of the stylistic corpus, what designs are placed where on the body, what designs aren't placed certain places on the body, and just finding some really fascinating things. And so, last year we went to the World Mummy Congress in Cuzco, where we presented 4 or 5 papers, I think, on this work, talking about everything from the origins of body modification to the research that we're doing to, our initial interpretations on how significant these practices may have been to Andean society.
Do you think you'll keep doing experimental work?
I don't know that. I don't know how much more experimental stuff I'm going to do. The experimental stuff ended up being really valuable because, in addition to recording all of these tattoos in Peru, we have a pretty good idea of how they're made. And one of the really cool things that I never would have predicted is that we have determined that over half of the tattoos are incised rather than punctured, rather than, being hand poked. And it's pretty unusual in the global sample to have 2 different tattooing techniques. Go out on a limb here and say that tattooing technologies tend to align with cultures. And so in a place like, for example, the Philippines, where you have multiple waves of migration of different cultures coming in, there are multiple tattooing technologies and techniques. South America, we haven't figured out quite exactly why we would have that yet, but that's been a really cool thing to figure out exactly how these marks were being made. There's some more experimentation I'd like to do looking at the actual chemical makeup of the tattoo pigments themselves that are preserved on human bodies, and trying to isolate better, for example, whether naturally occurring pigments, things like plants and things like this, plant juices may have been used in some locations and sometimes, as opposed to more stable pigments like carbon or iron base or earth pigments.
Do we know if people were being tattooed in the Pleistocene or in the Ice Age? Do we have any evidence of that?
We don't. We have those tools from Russia that are very, very old, but those are an isolated event at this point.
So earliest definitive evidence for tattooing is still Ötzi. There's nothing before that.
There's some really interesting anthropological literature about the correlation between marking the body and marking the earth, or marking the body and marking material culture. And so the same things, the same themes and ideas, and even placements that show up in temporary and permanent body art oftentimes are mirrored in rock art and pictographs and petroglyphs, in the decorations that are found on ceramic vessels and in weavings and canoes and all these kinds of things. And, I have this thing in my head that, no, we don't have any mummies from the late Ice Age, right? But we do have people making these incredible designs on cave walls. And, if that is significant to them in whatever sort of religious or cosmic or magical sense, putting it on walls is marking the body of the earth, which is almost universally conceived of as a woman, as a person. And if they're doing it on the earth, they're almost certainly doing it on their body. Fight me.
No, I'm above that ilk. I won't fight you. No, I would agree. Yeah, I'm above that ilk. I will fight you.
Stone tools, to me, probably came from primates cracking rocks together, realizing, okay, there's a sharp edge. Fire probably was invented through lightning or discovered through lightning, and then trying to replicate that. And then agriculture, was somebody saw seeds growing out of the debitage pile of seeds. And then lastly, metallurgy probably came from throwing shiny stuff into the fire, noticing it made cool colors, and then melted specific ways at different heats, then, made metallurgy. How did tattooing start? Was it just rubbing dirt in a wound?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question as to exactly what the mechanism is that it starts. There's this old sort of story among a lot of tattooers that, the first tattoo happens because, some caveman is sitting around a fire and cuts himself with his stone knife while he's working on his his spear or whatever, and carbon from the fire that's just around in the dirt and everything gets rubbed in there, and it's not going away. And it's probably like that, right? Like I really think that like all invention starts with a natural occurrence. Whether it's making beads out of seashells. Well, someone back thousands of years earlier found a shell with a hole in it. I think most of our early inventions mirror natural phenomenon. And so once people learned to, make ochre pigment or make carbon-based pigment, once they were using these pigments to, treat their material culture, to whether it was to treat the skin as an insecticide or, as a coagulant on wounds, or whether they were using it to paint the caves that they lived in, I think probably it's a very quick jump to putting those things onto and into the body then.
Anthropologically, dogs, obviously, to me, are extremely fascinating and part of being human, which I've mentioned. But anthropologically, like what is tattooing?
So what is tattooing to people? Anthropologically, right? Because it's different today. All of our information says that what we do today in the global westernized tattooing tradition is very different than what happened 100 years ago, or certainly 400 or 4,000 years ago. One of the things that I say about this is that, today we have a lot of autonomy in the tattooing process. You choose who tattoos you, where it is on your body, what the tattoo is, when you get it done in your life, what state you have it done in, all of these different things. And for most of human culture, as best we understand it now, that has not been the case. And instead, for most human cultures that have tattooed in the historic and I think in the deep past as well, all of those things were mandated by cultural phenomenon. So, when you got tattooed had to do with who you were, who your parents were, what you had accomplished, what your relationship was with animist forces that lived around you, what your community believed. All of that is tied into the tattoos, but also into the pigments, into the timing, into the tools themselves. All of these things, they're really, really important. And I think we can step back a little bit and say, well, obviously they're important, right? They let blood, they open wounds in the skin. This is a very dangerous process. So there have to be a lot of, taboos that arise around it. But also, I think that also says how important it is. And I think that's really, like one of the most important things that people considering tattooing in the deep past can understand is that this is not like our tradition. This is not something that people were free for the most part to choose what they got. These were marks that were very significant, that connected the human body to the other than human world around them.
I believe it was Jared Diamond's book, The Third Chimpanzee, that I read this in, so take it with a grain of salt. But he had pointed out that drinking alcohol is effectively drinking poison, and it shows your ability to handle poison. Or I think he even mentions tattooing as a form of like pain, and you're showing that you can undergo that pain. It's a permanent scar on your body. Do you throw any credence into that? Would you agree with that?
So I am not much into the signaling literature. Okay. And my reason for that has been that I feel like when we talk about tattooing as costly signaling, I feel like on one hand, it's true, right? It is dangerous, it is hurtful, it harms you, and it demonstrates to people around you that you sat through this process. Great. But to limit it to that, I think overlooks all of these really important cultural factors that underlie tattooing. So, one of the things that I did during my dissertation was, when I was linking all of this together and talking about why tattooing was important, came up with this sort of idea of tattooing as a network. And, so for me, the center of that network is the human body, the tools, and the pigment. So it's the 3 points of material culture that we as archaeologists could find. But then around those things are this huge network of other stuff. Identities, relationships, beliefs, the natural world, the tools that are available, natural phenomenon, just all of these things that then connect to each other and connect to those aspects of material culture. And it becomes this giant, Hutter, I think, calls it, the entangled web, right? The entanglement of tattooing. So it is a cultural phenomenon. It does put ink on your skin, but it is so much bigger than that. Another way I've been trying to talk about this recently is the idea of the cultural iceberg, right? The tattoo on your shoulder is the tip of the iceberg. It's the thing that sticks up above the water. It's the thing we can see. But much bigger than that, underneath the water, is all of these cultural forces and factors and relationships that go into what that tattoo is, how it is created, why it is created, whose body it's put on, all of these things. And so this is sort of what I really want to do with tattooed mummies, for example, is sort of swim upstream on this. So we've got the tattoos. We've got that tip of the iceberg. How can we go upstream, or in this analogy, dive down to this larger cultural phenomenon and learn about the culture, not just the individual?
All that said, is there a culture around so coming at it from a dog angle, obviously dogs in the Americas are the most intrinsic part, and then obviously the dingo in Australia is pretty synonymous with that Australian Aborigines. Is there a culture that to you like just screams this is a tattoo culture?
That's a really interesting question, and I think that sort of idea is very valid because it reflects sort of our modern idea of, there being, tattooers who do this or tattooers who do that, or someone who's an expert in black work, so I'm going to go to them, or watercolor, I'm going to go to them. But I think, again, looking at this anthropologically, I think we have to sort of think about tattooing as a craft practice. So if we're going to consider tattooing as weaving, as ceramics, as, not fire making, but say flint knapping, making art, I think we'd be hard pressed to look at the global sample and say, oh, these people made better ceramics than those people. They both made ceramics. They achieved their cultural need by creating ceramics. Now, whether those ceramics are, more finely made to our modern eye or not, was not something they were really concerned with, right? And so I think that's one of these things with tattooing is we just have to, sort of accept that all traditions are different. Every tradition is rooted in culture and language and belief and environment. And so the traditions are very different, but there are commonalities in the times of life where they're applied to the body and sort of the connections with the spiritual other world and things like that. Yeah.
So it's artistic expression.
Well, I would argue that, that art is not the right word for it. Again, any more than necessarily, if we think about ancient Peru, for example, certainly certain people made more fine weavings, for example. But, if the goal of the weaving is to cover the body or to cover the wall, then the quality of that, it has a separate cultural purpose than the actual creation of the piece, if that makes sense. Can you elaborate? Well, there's the cultural process of creating the thing, but then the resulting quality of the thing is another step beyond that. And so, it doesn't start out with people wanting to make fine art, oils, right? Oil paintings. It starts out with people painting, with people decorating material culture. And then eventually it turns into this thing where certain people are doing it better than others. And so this whole new thing arises. Certainly one of the things we see in the past is that in the deep past, particularly on these tattooed remains, we are now starting to find evidence of different levels of ability in the tattooer. So Danny and Gino Kaspari and I recently did with some Russian colleagues, did a paper on these high-resolution infrared images of one of the women from the Pazyrak Barrows in the Altai, in the Russian Altai. And she has these amazing tattoos on both of her forearms, and one of them is this complex scene of, multiple big cats, Siberian tigers or something, fighting with these deer, and the other one is this kind of this mythological griffin fighting a deer. But Danny, in looking at these through the eyes of a tattooer, could differentiate the quality of the work, and he could say, well, this arm with this complex scene is really well laid out. How it wraps around the arm is really incredible. All of the pieces of it make sense. On this one, the artist put the two front legs of the griffin on the same side of the body. That's not necessary, so this tells us that two different people were making these tattoos. Now, or it might have been the same person at different points in their career. maybe early and later or early and later, depending on, as their eyesight failed and their technique got worse. But as we get tattoos today, there's different qualities, there's different intents, there's different artists doing the work. And that's something we're being able to see in the deep sample from the deep past, which is, I think, really cool.
Interesting. So with lithics, we can understand skill in a certain way. You can compare good nappers and bad nappers and see how those flakes and how the scarring of those stone tools looks and compare them. You can also do that with gender. We can have a bunch of men and a bunch of women do flint napping, compare the metrics of the stone tools that are made from that, and see, okay, just statistically, do male flint napping, scars look more like this versus female. You can do that then with tattooing skill through experimental archaeology.
One of the really cool things related to that we found in the Peruvian sample is we found the first evidence of ancient blastovers. So we have found over tattooing, where individuals had something that then was covered over by a later tattoo. And that, I think, is really cool too, because I think we tend to, of course, everybody today, people laser it, they blast over, they black out, they do all these things. But, we sort of tend to think about tattooing in the past as being kind of almost monolithic, that the images are sacred or that they're, inviolate somehow. And this shows us that at least in this one place, at least on this one person, you could get something different later. That as the trajectory of your life changed, maybe as you believed in different things or moved to different places, we can't say why that happened, but the same tattoos didn't last them their whole life. They went and got something different.
Yeah. Why do some cultures, let's say like in Polynesia or Native Americans along the Atlantic coast, why do they allow tattooing, whereas people in Victorian England completely shunned it?
So I have this kind of a rap. It's kind of a soapbox about empires and tattooing, right? Empires hate tattooing. Broad generalization, right? But, if you think about this from the idea that tattoos are a way that groups, that villages, that families, that indigenous communities form a cohesive identity by having the same tradition marked on their body, the same way they do by speaking the same language, the same way they do by dressing the same way. Empires don't want diversity in their empire. They want to take all of these different people and subsume them under the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, or the Judeo-Christian Empire, or the Han Chinese Empire. They want people to speak their language, worship their gods, wear their clothes. And throughout human history, not just the Judeo-Christian history, but all over the world, empires have done this. The Inca did this, the Han Chinese did this, et cetera, et cetera. And so I believe that very early on in those processes, in the same moments that empires are removing the languages and the clothing and the traditions of communities, they are also stamping out those tattooing traditions. Everybody around them was using it for positivity and inclusion and a mark of belonging, and they subverted that and said, we're going to, the barbarians on the hinterlands do it, so we're going to put it on slaves, we're going to put it on people that are criminals, we're going to use it to punish people and dehumanize them. And Han Chinese Empire did very much the same thing.
So that scene in Gladiator where Russell Crowe is picking off the SPQR tattoo, which I believe is Senatus Populus Romanus, like Senate and People of Rome, what it means. He's picking that off. So that's kind of like an accurate scene.
Yeah, so there is some evidence that the Romans in particular marked certain people as being owned by the empire. And so, the SPQR is that's a modern thing. We don't know exactly what they were using. It probably wasn't that. But the one that sticks out to me is I think it was maybe like metalsmiths, blacksmiths that were marked as being owned by the empire because their services, they were basically pressed into service and then marked as being belonging to the empire. So yeah, there's actually some, I think there's a nugget of truth to that whole Russell Crowe scene, right? He is leaving the empire. He's no longer a Roman soldier. He's going out on his own. He's, shunning the empire. Well, he's going to take that logo off.
Yeah. You went and saw all those mummies in Peru, and Peru was clearly an empire at a time, the Inca and whatever came before that. Is there something similar going on in Peru?
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things we're seeing in Peru is that we have this this history of these tattoos that goes back over at least an 800-year period. And that 800 years in the central coast of Peru, so the area sort of around Lima, that cuts across multiple valleys and multiple empires. And so what we're thinking is that the tattooing may be more related to like a vernacular religion, something that is more deeply rooted, that people were practicing before the empires came on the scene and then continued to practice afterwards. And one of the really interesting pieces of evidence for that, I think, is that we don't find the temple gods in tattoos. So, at the big corporate level in these same cultures, you have the staff god, the dude holding the two staves, or, the crocodile guy holding the cacti or things like that. None of those hominids show up in the tattoos. And instead it's cats, it's fish, and it's birds are the three main themes. And so those things that shift over political changes don't make it into the tattooing tradition.
When I'm doing my research for dog stuff, I find Cook's journals or Columbus's journals or Cortez's journals or Abel Tasman's journals. And then I find an open source of it, and then Control F for dog. And sometimes I'll do wolf or pet or something like that. Tattooing, I assume you can Control F for tattooing, but that word probably didn't exist for a while, right? Like, how do you go about doing that research? Are you looking for body modification or pigment? How do you search for it?
Yeah, so historical research on tattooing is really interesting. I don't think that, Lars or I or anybody who's doing this kind of research, I don't think this would have been possible that we would have achieved so much if we were doing it 35 years ago, 40 years ago, before the digitization had begun, before things were word searchable, right? Going back to like when I was in grad school, if I wanted to look at Cortez's journals, I'd have to go to that library, put on the white gloves, open it, and then try to decipher the Spanish handwriting myself, right? And now, archive.org and the Smithsonian and all of these incredible open access resources are online. And so, yeah, you're able to word search for these things. Now, the trick here, right, is that the word tattoo doesn't enter the European lexicon until after Cook's voyages. Okay. And so particularly when you're looking at early colonial encounters in America, you're dealing with French and Spanish and English and German, depending on the source and the location. And you're dealing with all kinds of different words that are used to refer to tattooing. And so at one point, I think I gave up on even trying to that. And I was looking for things like, blood, prick, needle, awl, bone, things like this. And you're just going through the same document again and again, using all of these correlate words that might get you to that description of tattooing. I think a thing a lot of people don't understand in the age of the internet is that people just kind of take historical sources for granted now. So, now when we read something about, let's say, a Spanish account in Florida from the 1500s, people can access that in English as a translated version. And so today you'll read that and that account will say, and then they tattooed their bodies with marks that could never be removed. But the original Spanish version of that says something like, and then they pricked their skin with great needles and rubbed into it pigment that was unchangeable. Right. So translators have since then made this decision to put the word tattoo on that, but that's not actually what it said originally. And a funny sort of connection to that tangentially is that's why we have the problem of Viking tattooing.
I remember you telling me.
Yeah, so there's just one single historical record of possible medieval Norse tattooing where a man from Baghdad goes up the Volga River in Russia and encounters the Rus, who, depending on which scholar you talk to, may or may not have been Viking influenced. And he describes their bodies in one very short paragraph as being, sort of decorated from head to toe in green lines. And at a certain point, 30 years ago or so, a translator translating this account into English decided to say they are tattooed. And that has given rise to this idea that the medieval Norse were tattooed. Now, there's a lot of problems with that. For example, people living in Baghdad had a word for tattoo. They were tattooed. The people around them were tattooed. He was writing a chronicle for his peers. So if he wanted to say these hairy primitives are tattooed, he would have said the word. And instead, he danced around it in this kind of, oblique way. Julius Caesar is another great example of that, right? There are, I think, maybe no historical conclusive accounts of tattooing of the Picts or Celts, or that sort of Iron Age Britain culture. All of it comes back to Julius Caesar and translations of what his account might or might not say. Now, as a Roman, he knew tattooing. He had a word for it, stigma, and if he wanted to say they were tattooed, he would use that word, but he didn't. That's so interesting. Okay. Now, I could be completely wrong, right? A tattooed Viking could fall out of the ice tomorrow, and I hope I would get to work on it, and I would say absolutely I've been wrong up until this point. But we have to evaluate the full picture. We can't just cherry pick our history to get the version that we want.
Interesting. So a lot of people I see online are like, these Vikings is my indigenous heritage as like European, which, very well could, whatever. Tattoos then, is that like a sign of indigenous revival and like cultural expression in that sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's all over the world, right? And I'm there. I've been really interested in the ways in which groups who do not necessarily have a proven tattooing history in the deep past have looked at ways to work that into their culture, into their modern cultural identity. Whether that's Vikings or whether that's, folks in Europe there. I mean, you don't see a lot of people rushing to get Ötzi's tattoos, right? They're not really, they're not really attractive. They're not really this thing. But on the other hand, there are people doing incredible tattoos based on cave art and decorated bones. And, Rhoda particularly is doing such amazing work on this. And I think what's really cool is that the people who are doing the best work, they don't refer to it as a revival. So they're not pretending that this is something that definitely existed in the past that we are reviving. Instead, they are inventing, they are creating, they are connecting modern bodies with the material culture of the past. And that is 100% valid.
That's so cool.
Well, I guess I'll just add this here if I remember to put it in, but anytime I have a Tori make artwork for me, like you pop up as like a Jedi ghost telling me like it needs tattoos, and I go back. Not that it's like in the deep Ice Age that Neanderthals aren't tattooed, but when it's an indigenous American, I would it's something I think about now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why weren't the Neanderthals tattooed? Neanderthals were carving decorations onto material culture. They were painting on the walls.
Yeah.
There are Neanderthal crayons. There are ochres that are from Neanderthal sites that are worked into basically crayons, so they were putting pigment on material culture. So why not? I mean, again, we share 99% of our DNA with them. If we're doing it, why wouldn't they have been doing it?
That's a Neanderthal Marines eating crayons joke there.
Yeah, right. A Neanderthal with hold fast on his knuckles that's just, riding that mastodon down.
Yeah. I need to think of that. Okay, yeah, that's fascinating. I totally do that. So it has changed my perspective of the past. Like, okay, these people were tattooed. So something I find extremely fascinating is like when I'm looking through Cook's journals or Columbus's journals, that period of time, the Clement Exchange is just... Personally, I think BC AD is dumb. We should just do 1492 onward because it's the world changes. But
right.
That's a whole other video. But at that time, that's where people like the Europeans and the Judeo-Christian mindset, the Western view of the world, starts to see tattoos all over the place. Is that...
Yeah, so there's a really interesting history there around the Columbian Exchange. Really, it's a little bit later than Columbus. It starts in the 1500s, and with these Europeans moving into North America and South America and around the tip of South America into Polynesia, and then Marco Polo going east, ending up in Southeast Asia where people are tattooing. And for a long time, the sort of conventional wisdom was that tattooing was brought back to Europe by those people, is that there was no one tattooing in Europe. This was something that happened on the periphery, and it was brought back during the Age of Discovery. And that's when Europeans started tattooing. And Luc Renaud and others have, Matt Loder and others have done this incredible historic work showing that that is not the case. There were people tattooing in Europe at least as early as the late Middle Ages. Now there's a hard break between Ötzi and the late Middle Ages there, right? But that is, those are the data points we have to work with. But we know that by the late Middle Ages, Europeans are tattooing. And the tattoos that they're putting on their body by that time are essentially then unchanged. The themes and ideas, the same sort of, they're not putting bluebirds on their collarbones, right? But they're putting, Judeo-Christian, pilgrimage marks on their body, and metalsmiths are getting anvils and tongs tattooed on them, and circus performers are getting circus men tattooed on them, or boxers are getting boxers, and it's more of a mark of profession and belief, but they're already there, and so when Europeans start trafficking Polynesians and Native North Americans back to Europe to put them on display, part of why they're doing this is because of how heavily they're tattooed they are. But the people in the streets were themselves familiar with tattoos. If they'd been to the seaport, if they'd been to a brothel, they'd seen people with tattoos. So it wasn't the tattoos themselves that were so exotic necessarily as the coverage and the themes, on this mostly naked body. I think that has a lot to do with it, particularly in the Victorian era. To be naked is synonymous with being poor. More cloth, bigger clothes means wealth. Where you see naked bodies is in the seaports, is in the brothels, is in the working class, is in the poor people. And that's where you see the tattoos on their bodies too. And so I think there's sort of that sort of dichotomy that evolves in the European mindset, that then sort of, filters out into the historical record. Matt Loader, who I mentioned, has done an amazing job of taking that headline that says something to the effect of tattoos are not just for criminals and prostitutes anymore. And he's found an example of that headline going back all the way through Victorian England, like once a decade, going back for over 100 years.
In newspapers?
Yes, yeah, like newspapers and magazines. So for over 100 years, reporters have been saying, hey, it's not just criminals and prostitutes that are tattooed anymore. And so that begs the question of, like, was it ever just criminals and prostitutes? Probably not.
Yeah. Is that where, sailors, that's why were they most associated with tattoos, because they were seeing it around the world and it was more common?
No, so this is a thing that I think is really fascinating, is that the sailor tattooing traditions, what they were getting done on their bodies, that was happening before those points of contact and after those points of contact continued almost unchanged. And so the reason we know this is from things like service records, the seaman certificates, where seamen were recorded with all of their scars and how they would be identified, and that was partly to identify their bodies if we needed to, but also because seamen kept getting pressed onto service on other ships, right? So it was to keep track of people. And there's some amazing European historical records around like convicts being shipped to Australia, and it's recording the tattoos that they had on their bodies. And the themes of these things are, love symbols and animals and birds and, dates and places. And it's basically then remains unchanged. No one in Europe starts getting Polynesian tattoos once they've seen them. They do, a couple decades later, start getting Japanese style tattoos. The interest in Japan specifically breaks that mold. And particularly the European upper class becomes very interested in getting Japanese style tattoos. And then there's at least one, maybe a couple of Japanese artists who then travel to Europe and that system of exchange and actually are tattooing people in Europe and on ships and things.
Are you able to explain the significance of Polynesian tattoos? If I think of tattoos anthropologically, I think of like the Maori, who are, with the facial tattoos or head to toe, huge geometric patterns and things like that. Are you able to Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely not. Yeah. I mean, it's the short answer is that it's a little bit different for every group in Polynesia. And yeah, right. Every island has a distinct material culture and has a distinct belief system. And there are things that cross those boundaries of water. And, there are interesting stories in there about, sort of mythical stories about how tattooing is passed from one island to the other by sort of these, culture hero sorts of characters. But, what it actually is doing on the body and the specific forms, the specific icons, how much of the body it covers is different from place to place.
So the significance of them being tattooed like head to toe and all over their face, what can you add to that?
It would be pure supposition, right? Okay, so yeah, so regarding this question of like why some cultures are so tattooed and others, maybe like Ötzi, for example, have just like these very small marks in certain places on their body. I think that's going to be different for every culture you talk about. In some cases, we know that, what is actually in the pigment itself is culturally significant. And so having greater or lesser amounts of it on your body correlate to, greater or lesser spirituality, greater or lesser abilities to connect with the other world, things like this. There is the idea throughout Polynesia, but particularly in certain locations of tapu, of that certain things are dangerous, and coming into contact with the body causes danger to the body. And my understanding is that in that setting, one of the ways that you can protect the body is by wrapping it in clothing, in bark cloth clothing, and that wrapping the body in tattoos performs a similar function. That being wrapped in those same patterns that appear on the bark cloth on your body as tattoos help to repel, everything from bad luck to evil spirits to sickness to, malevolent ancestors, et cetera, et cetera.
You had mentioned to me one time, I think this was years ago, that if you notice the illustrations by John White along the Atlantic coast with the Powhatans and the Algonquian people, were very similar to like Celtic illustrations that the Romans had done. And they tried to paint the natives in the Atlantic coast as looking almost Celtic in nature. I guess that's what English people had reference to in their culture to Aboriginal or tribal cultures. Can you elaborate more on that?
The John White record from the coastal Carolinas is a really interesting account. John White himself does not describe tattooing in text, but he leaves this visual record behind. And in that visual record, he does depict Algonquin people with tattoos. Now this gets complicated, right? Because then the John White original watercolors are reproduced by other people, and the tattoos change slightly. And so depending on which folio or which image you're looking at, the same person might have slightly different tattoos. Or when those watercolors are adapted by Theodore de Bry into engravings for publication in books, they're changed again. And so, you sort of have these steps, this kind of almost telephone game where people who have never been to Americas are basing it on what they saw, who's basing it on what they saw, who's basing it on John White. And so, the result is that you'll get these very famous and identifiable images of Algonquin people, and you can put up 7 of them, and all of them will have different tattoos depending on the version and the European artist that made them. But all of that aside, we do think that the Algonquin people were tattooing. A couple of the other people on that expedition, Thomas Harriot, I believe, does describe the tattooing process.
Interesting. And I've noticed a lot of indigenous people on Instagram and influencers, and some friends as well, have kind of reclaimed the facial tattoos. I think they're more Inuit, or the ones on the cheekbones, but like facial ones down on the chin seem to be more like is it a plains thing or a coastal thing? Can you elaborate more on that? Is it like an indigenous revival?
Yes, facial tattooing in the Americas particularly is really interesting. Really throughout the entirety of both North and South America, there is this strong pan-continental tradition of women's facial tattooing, and particularly, lower lip to chin. I guess peribuccal tattooing would be the technical term. But we see that in cultures from, the southern tip of South America up through the Inuit in the northern polar regions. And I wouldn't want to speak to what those specific marks mean, particularly now that they are being revitalized, because the people that are doing that work are working, they're working with their own ancestral knowledge and their own cultures. And regardless of what I think as an outsider, or, what this historic account says, right? What they're doing with it is what's most important in these revivals. And so, I'd say anyone who's interested in that should absolutely seek out one of these indigenous folks who's doing that work and ask them about it.
Absolutely. Aaron, is there anything from your book that I did not bring up that you would like to mention?
No, I mean, the thing that has resonated with me most deeply about tattooing has been the relationships. I know that's kind of a cop out, right? People want you to say, oh, it's the tattooed mummies. The tattooed mummies are freaking awesome. But, honestly, tattooing for me has been about building community and building relationships. And I never would have predicted that I would have this, network, this community of people, of friends, of colleagues all over the world who are so interested in this same thing, and that, that I get along so well with, and that we have these, these friendships and these collaborations together. And that for me has been the most inspiring and important thing of this entire process.
Social media is kind of wild.
Yeah.
What's your Instagram handle?
Archaeology Inc.
And what do you do with that?
Well, right now I'm not doing much with it. In the past, the feed as it originally started, as inspired by you, was just sort of throwing out, cool things about indigenous and ancient tattooing.
Yeah.
And over time, it sort of evolved more to focus more directly on my research and my colleagues' research and the things that we were doing. And it has gone a little quiet since I got my PhD. I was sort of firing on all cylinders there for a couple of years, and got the PhD, got the doctorate in hand, and everything was kind of like, okay. And we're sort of moving on to the next run of research now. I think since I started doing that account, I don't know how many years ago that was, there's a lot more information online now, particularly in the social media sphere, about ancient and indigenous tattooing. And I like the stuff that's out there now. One of my big gripes about indigenous tattooing, particularly, and how it's portrayed in the media and in social media particularly, is that for a long time it has tended to be very exhibitionist. It's very like, artsy pictures of tattooed indigenous people with no information about who they are, where they are, why they had this done, or anything like this. And I think that there's been a real sea change in that, where people are actually taking the time to look into those histories now and share them out.
Very Boazian of you.
Yeah. That's really cool. I never think about that. Well, I guess because he went out there, people were just collecting masks and doing, bringing it back and showing it off. He was just asking questions like, why do you make this?
Why do you do that? Yeah. And it's, even the stuff happening today is I think not perfect, particularly the stuff done by outsiders, including myself, because I think there's always a temptation to try to take the easiest answer, that sort of, the easiest answer must be the right one kind of thing. And so it's very easy to say something like, men receive tattoos for taking the heads of their enemies. Great. But also, the spiritual energy of that human's body was believed to reside most strongly in their head, which is why warriors were taking the heads of their enemies back to their home villages, was so that energy could be deployed for things like crop fertility and, protection against disease and success in child rearing and things like this. And so the person carrying that very dangerous well of energy off of the battlefield and back to their village had to get these marks in order to interact with, in order to protect themselves, and in order to access those parts of the animist world that they were interacting with.
Yeah.
And so, again, here's the tattoo, here's the iceberg down beneath it, right?
Right. I suppose your tattoos aren't, animistic or to bring a captor's energy back to your village, but I know you have Ötzi tattoos, right?
Yeah, I have, I this again is part of this process of, I got my first tattoos back in, in grad school. It would have been around like 2001 or so. And, would not have foreseen that I would have this many tattoos in the future. Disappoint my wife every day with that. But this is, I think, a thing of part. So part of my tattoos are, important to me. Some of them are things that I got because they speak to me. Some of them are things that I got as part of the experimental process. So, my wrist, these two are, they are Ötzi because, I got a connection to the guy, but also because I wanted to see what single point bone needle tattooing looked like and felt like. The lines above them, Danny did with stones, they're stone incision. And so, this is a ability for me to experience the difference in those techniques. And, let's call it experiential archaeology instead of experimental archaeology, right? But then another, most of my tattoos at this point, I think, relate to this idea of community. These are things that have been not to wax too poetic about it, but things that have been given to me by people that I treasure and that I respect. And, some of them relate to the things I'm doing. Some of them are just things that have been given to me. And, somewhere along the way, you get to where I am as a human.
Lastly, we mentioned the last part of your book, but if there's anything else that you'd like the world to know about tattooing that you'd like to say today that I could cut and clip, what would that be?
Ötzi's tattoos might not have been medicinal.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Okay. So, one of the things that's been repeated again about Ötzi for the last 30 years is that his tattoos were medicinal or therapeutic, is that they were put on places on his body where he suffered from disease or ailments. And as part of our reassessment of Ötzi's tattoos, one of the things that we did is we actually mapped out all of his tattoos and all of the diagnosed ailments on his body, and fewer than half of them correspond. So, there are injuries and ailments that you suffer from that don't reflect, that can't be identified on your corpse, right? That we might not be able to find. But I think that we need to question why we ever said that to begin with. That was a result of really early analysis of his tattoos and sort of these ideas that surrounded that, which were, his tattoos were not symbolic because they were just simple straight lines or crossed lines. And the people who were saying that were not themselves tattooers, and were comparing him to the Siberian mummies, who have these incredible scenes tattooed all over their bodies. And so their idea was, well, if these aren't representational, if they're not symbolic, if they can't be read by others, then they must be something personal or medicinal or therapeutic. And I don't think we can say that, right? I think, there's that lack of correlation just at the statistical level between his tattoos and his injuries. But also, he's tattooed in places on his body where he couldn't reach himself. He was probably tattooed at different points in his life. The folks who study him have this thing they're talking about now as in terms of his receiving care in his community. And I think that then becomes something that we should talk about. So maybe these tattoos are less about him treating arthritis in his knee, say, than him receiving care within the community of where he lived.
If you're familiar with my podcasts, I always ask, what does it mean to be human, or what do dogs mean to you? So in this sense, Aaron, what does it mean to be human, but can you answer that in a tattoo-centered way?
Yeah, well, so what does it mean to be human? So what I learned in grad school, right, is that being a modern human, right, symbolically modern human, means blades, bones, and beauty. Right? So you're making fancy knives that are hafting onto other implements. You're not just holding a stone in your hand. You're making bone tools, multi-component bone tools, things like fish hooks, things like arrowheads that are being hafted onto arrow shafts. And then beauty, you're making things like cave art and beads and body decoration. And so, I think that if we can sort of lump that, I think we could argue about that, right? Because there are certainly non-human cultures that do that. We think Neanderthals might be doing some of that too. Homo erectus might be doing some of that as well. So, that's an interesting discussion to have. But I think that body decoration and modification fits into that bucket of beauty. And so, altering our bodies to match our inner selves, altering our bodies to reflect our social selves, all of these things are what, again, forms community. I've said community a lot in this conversation, right? But these are things that link people together, that form groups, that, that create bonds and reiterate bonds over time. And so, yeah, I think that, tattoos to be human.
Excellent. Yeah, this was awesome, dude. So thank you.
Well, and thank you so much for having me, man. And I would have to, say the Instagram wouldn't exist without you having said I should do it. And, my biggest collaboration with Danny wouldn't have existed without you introducing us. So, you got a big hand in all of this, man. And yeah, I so appreciate it. And so the Instagram is Archaeology Inc. And there's two books. There's Ancient Ink, The Archaeology of Tattooing, and there's Drawing with Great Needles, which is Ancient Tattooing Traditions of North America.
Well, proud of you.
And so both of those are very academic, but they're available at finer online booksellers near you.
That has been another episode of Ethnosynology. I could talk to Aaron for hours. I had to cut some of this out for time. Some of the stuff was just us talking in between takes and whatnot. But yeah, if there's more you want to know about tattooing, do let me know, and I will contact Aaron and we'll do another episode. I'm sure I'll have him back on again. Now that he's been established, in person through the video, we can have him come in for a Zoom or a virtual meeting to talk about anything else. But yeah, this is, I think, among my anthropological interests, this is like something that I always, anytime I get tattooed, I tell people like, hey, you should read my friend's book, or like, did you know tattooing is this old, or something like that. Like, I just find this so interesting in the same sense that I find the dog stuff interesting. So I hope you guys did too. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to rate and review the podcast. That really helps us out, helps me out, but it also helps the network out. And if you're not already subscribed on YouTube, please subscribe. Please subscribe. That really helps. And then make sure you always hit the like button. And if you can, leave a comment. But other than that, we are out.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.